In 1987, a school bus carrying 12 children vanished without a trace on a quiet country road. No bodies, no wreckage, just gone. For 35 years, the town buried the mystery until an aging teacher, haunted by the past, uncovered a secret too terrifying to ignore. But the truth was never meant to be found, and now someone will do anything to keep it buried. Before continuing this mysterious story, let us know where you're watching from. If you like this story, subscribe to the channel for daily upcoming stories notification. Willow Creek was the kind of town where nothing ever changed. The autumn leaves danced along the quiet streets, their golden and crimson colors catching the morning light. The air smelled of fresh coffee from Ruby's Diner, where old men read newspapers and talked about football. The clock tower in the town square had been broken for years, stuck at 8:16, but no one ever bothered to fix it. People liked things just the way they were. That's why no one saw it coming. No one imagined that on an ordinary Tuesday morning, a school bus would vanish into thin air, taking 22 children and 2 adults with it. No one thought Willow Creek would become a town of ghosts, a place where mothers sat in front of empty bedrooms, where fathers woke up at night calling out names that would never answer. And no one, not even Eleanor Grayson, could have predicted that her one moment of weakness, staying home sick instead of going on the field trip, would haunt her for the rest of her life. Eleanor Grayson never missed a school day. At 44 years old, she had been teaching 3rd grade for nearly 2 decades, and every student who passed through her classroom knew one thing for certain. Mrs. Grayson cared about them like they were her own children. She wasn't the kind of teacher who stood at the blackboard and droned on about multiplication tables. She made learning fun. She used silly voices when reading stories. She let her students call her Miss Ellie because Mrs. Grayson sounded too formal. She hung their drawings on the walls and made sure everyone had a role in the classroom, even the shy kids. That's why it hurt her so much to miss the field trip that day. It was just a cold, nothing serious. But John, her husband, had insisted, "Ellie, you never stop. One day won't kill you." He had no idea how wrong he was. So for the first time in years, Eleanor stayed home. She watched through the window as the bright yellow school bus pulled away from Willow Creek Elementary. She could still hear the children laughing and shouting, their faces pressed against the glass, waving. She would never see them again. The bus ride was supposed to be fun. It was a warm, crisp morning. The radio played an old pop song, barely heard over the sound of 22 children talking all at once. Excitement buzzed in the air. The field trip to Ashwood Historical Site was something they had been looking forward to for weeks. Tommy Carter, the class clown, had already stolen someone's baseball cap and was wearing it backward, making funny faces. Sarah Mitchell, the quiet artist, sat by the window, sketching in her notebook, glancing up every now and then to take in the scenery. Emily Dawson, the teacher's pet, was already reminding everyone of the rules, adjusting her big glasses every few seconds. And then there was Mr. Harold, the bus driver, an older man, mid-60s, silver hair always hidden under a cap, eyes tired but kind. He had been driving the school bus for years. He wasn't much of a talker, but the kids liked him. He always had peppermints in his pocket and a small radio playing softly as he drove. Everything seemed normal, until the turn. A wrong turn, a road that shouldn't have been there. No one saw the bus again. The last person to see the bus was Jacob Palmer, a farmer who lived a few miles outside town. He had been out in his field fixing a broken fence post when he saw the big yellow bus rumble past. Nothing strange about that, except it was taking the old Hollow Creek Road. Jacob frowned. That road hadn't been used in years. It didn't lead to Ashwood. In fact, it didn't really lead anywhere. Just an old bridge, a dead end, and miles of thick, empty woods. He watched as the bus rolled into the fog, and then, as if swallowed by the earth itself, it never came out the other side. By noon, the children should have been at the historical site. By 1 p.m., the teachers should have received a phone call saying they were on their way back. By 3 p.m., parents began to worry. By 5 p.m., panic set in. The police were called. The search began. No skid marks, no broken glass, no signs of an accident. The bus had disappeared, and so did 22 children. By nightfall, Willow Creek was a town of flashing lights and desperate voices. The police station had never seen this kind of chaos before. Sheriff Walter Briggs, a sturdy man in his 50s with a thick mustache and deep-set eyes, had been in charge for over 20 years. But nothing, not fires, not storms, not even the bank robbery back in '79, had ever shaken him like this. A missing school bus? 22 missing children? It didn't make sense. Briggs stood by the radio, listening to the crackling voices of his deputies searching the back roads. They found nothing. No broken-down bus, no skid marks, no sign that a vehicle had even been on Hollow Creek Road at all. It was as if the bus had never existed. News spread like wildfire. Parents gathered outside the school, demanding answers. Mothers sobbed, fathers shouted, teachers stood in stunned silence. Eleanor Grayson arrived late, her coat barely buttoned, hair still damp from washing her face after hours of crying. She searched for John, her husband, but he was nowhere in sight. He had always been the calm one, but even he couldn't handle this. She saw the empty school parking lot, the place where the bus should have returned. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was impossible. Buses don't just disappear, she whispered to herself, gripping her coat tighter. But that was the problem. This one had. Jacob Palmer, the farmer, was the only one who saw something. Deputy Mark Holloway knocked on his door late that night. Jacob opened it, rubbing his tired eyes, dressed in an old flannel shirt and worn-out jeans. "You're the last person to have seen the bus, Mr. Palmer," the deputy said. "What exactly did you see?" Jacob told him about the turn, about the bus taking Hollow Creek Road, a place that hadn't been used in years. Holloway frowned. "That road leads to a dead end," he muttered. "No one would take that road by mistake." Jacob agreed. "But that's the thing, deputy," he said, lowering his voice. "I saw it go in. I watched it disappear into the fog." Holloway leaned forward. "And," Jacob hesitated, "I never saw it come back out." By midnight, the search teams returned empty-handed. Sheriff Briggs rubbed his temples, exhausted. "It's impossible," he muttered. "It has to be somewhere." But the search dogs found nothing. The footprints on the dirt road led nowhere. The tire tracks ended suddenly, as if the bus had been lifted off the ground. No accidents, no bodies, no wreckage. The bus, and everyone on it, was simply gone. Eleanor sat at the edge of her bed, unable to sleep. John stood in the doorway watching her. His face was tired, his hair messy from running his hands through it all night. "I should have been there," Eleanor whispered. John sighed. "Ellie, if I had been on that bus, maybe I could have stopped it. Maybe I could have—" "Stopped what?" John interrupted. "We don't even know what happened." Eleanor's breath hitched. Tears stung her eyes. "But they were my kids," she choked out. John walked over and knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his own. "They were our kids," he said softly. "This whole town lost them today." Eleanor met his gaze, but deep down she knew it wasn't the same. The town lost them, but she abandoned them, and she would never forgive herself for that. Weeks passed, then months. The FBI got involved. Psychics were called in. Reporters flocked to the town, turning Willow Creek into a media circus. People offered wild theories, a kidnapping ring, a sinkhole, even aliens. But the truth was much worse, because there was no truth, no leads, no answers, no bodies. Just a missing school bus in a town that would never be the same again. By the time the one-year anniversary arrived, most people stopped talking about it. Parents who lost their children moved away. Teachers avoided the subject. The town tried to heal, but Eleanor never did. She quit her job, stopped attending church. She barely spoke to anyone, not even Lily, her teenage daughter, who was now angry all the time. Angry that her mother couldn't be there for her anymore. Even John, the man who had once loved her fiercely, started pulling away. "Ellie," he said one evening, his voice careful, "you have to let this go." But she couldn't, because somewhere deep in her gut, Eleanor knew the truth. The children were still out there, and she was going to find them, no matter what it cost. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, alone, with a pile of old newspapers and missing person reports spread in front of her. The house was quiet now. Lily was always out, hanging around with the wrong crowd, coming home late, slamming doors. John had stopped trying to reach her. He barely spoke to Eleanor at all. She didn't blame him. Eleanor picked up a faded photo, a class picture from that year. Tommy, Sarah, Emily, 22 children, smiling, frozen in time. She flipped through the police reports. Bus driver, Mr. Harold Wilson, 52 years old, no criminal record, no history of violence. Last sighting, Hollow Creek Road, turning onto the old route. Final radio call. Never made. A whole school bus had disappeared off the face of the earth, and after 1 year the case was officially considered cold. Eleanor refused to accept that. Someone knew something, and she was going to find out who. Her first stop was Joe's Diner, the place where all the town gossip lived and thrived. The bell above the door jingled as Eleanor stepped inside. The smell of coffee and fried eggs filled the air. Old men sat at the counter, muttering over their morning coffee. A group of waitresses paused their conversation when they saw her. Everyone knew Eleanor Grayson. She walked up to Joe himself, the owner, a heavy-set man with gray stubble and a cigarette permanently dangling from his lips. "Morning, Eleanor," Joe greeted, though there was pity in his voice. "Haven't seen you around in a while." Eleanor didn't bother with small talk. "I need to know about Hollow Creek Road," she said. Joe's smile faltered. The diner grew a little quieter. "Hollow Creek?" he asked. "What for?" She pulled out a photo, the one from the police files. The last place the bus was seen. Joe exhaled sharply, rubbing his chin. "You don't want to go digging into that," he muttered. "Why?" Joe hesitated, then leaned in closer, his voice lowering. "Because some roads ain't meant to be traveled," he said. Joe wouldn't say more. Nobody in the diner would, but he did tell her one thing. "If you really want to know about Hollow Creek, go ask Lester Barlow." Eleanor had heard that name before. Everyone had. Lester Barlow was an ex-cop. He had been kicked off the force in the 70s after an investigation went sideways. He lived on the outskirts of town, in a rotting trailer surrounded by rusted-out cars. People called him a drunk, a liar, a man with too many secrets. She knocked on his trailer door. Nothing. She knocked again, louder. Finally, the door swung open, and there he was, a tall, wiry man with graying hair, sharp blue eyes, and a cigarette dangling from his lips. "If you're selling Jesus, I ain't buying," he grumbled. "I'm here about the missing school bus," Eleanor said. Lester stared at her. Then, without a word, he slammed the door in her face. Eleanor wasn't giving up. She went straight to Hollow Creek Road, driving her old station wagon along the narrow, overgrown path. The trees were dense here, their branches twisting over the road like skeletal hands. Fog curled around the ground, making the air thick and heavy. She pulled over at the exact spot where the bus had last been seen. She stepped out. The silence was unsettling. No birds, no wind, nothing. Then, a snap of a twig behind her. She spun around. No one was there. But for the first time, Eleanor felt it. The feeling that she wasn't alone. That night, she dreamed of the children. She was on the bus, sitting at the front, watching them laugh and play. Then, a sudden jolt. The bus swerved. The driver, Mr. Harold, was staring at something in the road, his face twisted in horror. Eleanor turned her head, following his gaze, and she saw it. A shadowy figure standing in the middle of the road, tall, unmoving. The bus plunged into darkness, and then she woke up, sweating, heart pounding. What the hell had she just seen? 2 days later, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table once again, surrounded by newspaper clippings. She flipped through an old article, the last known photo of the missing bus. Something caught her eye. A car in the background, a black sedan tailing the bus just before it disappeared. Her heart jumped into her throat. She grabbed a magnifying glass, leaning in closer, and then she saw it, the license plate. This wasn't just some random car. It belonged to someone in town. She took the photo to the police station. Sheriff Briggs barely looked at it. "This case is closed, Eleanor," he said flatly. She slammed her hand on his desk. "There's proof right here." "I said it's closed." His eyes were cold, hard, And that's when she understood. Someone didn't want this case reopened, and whoever it was, they had the sheriff on their side. That night, her house was broken into. The files she collected, gone. Her photo evidence, ripped to shreds. And on her kitchen table, left behind in the mess, a single note scrawled in red ink. Let it go, or next time, we take more than just your files. Eleanor is now trapped in a deadly game. The town is against her. She's getting too close to something dangerous, and now someone is watching her. The mystery is deepening, and her life is on the line. Eleanor didn't call the police. What was the point? The sheriff had made it clear. They weren't on her side. Instead, she sat in the wreckage of her kitchen, staring at the warning note. Let it go. She wasn't going to let it go, because someone was scared. Someone didn't want her to keep digging, which meant she was finally on the right path. But she needed help, and she knew exactly who to ask. Lester Barlow didn't open the door this time. Eleanor pounded on it until she heard movement inside. When the door cracked open, Lester's sharp blue eyes studied her. I told you to stay away. Eleanor pushed past him, stepping inside. The trailer smelled like whiskey and old cigarettes. Papers were stacked in messy piles. On the table, an old police badge tossed aside like trash. She held up the ripped photo of the black sedan. You were a cop back then. You knew about this case. Lester sighed, rubbing his face. I don't get involved in dead cases. This isn't dead, she pointed at the warning note. Somebody broke into my house last night. They stole my files. They're scared of what I'll find. Lester's face darkened. He grabbed a bottle of whiskey, poured himself a glass, then hesitated. Without a word, he poured her one too. Lester leaned back, staring at his drink. You know why I got kicked off the force? Eleanor shook her head. Because I was the only dumb son of a bitch who asked too many questions. He pulled out a dusty old folder, tossing it on the table. Inside were reports the town had buried. Unmarked cars spotted near Hollow Creek Road. Strange disappearances before the bus went missing. A powerful family name appearing too many times in police records. And then, a name she recognized. Sheriff Briggs. The same man who had shut her down at the station. Her hands shook as she flipped through the pages. It wasn't just a missing bus. It was something bigger. One report caught her attention. A witness had seen a white farmhouse near Hollow Creek Road, a place where children's screams were heard at night. But when police checked, the house was gone. Eleanor grabbed her keys. She needed to see it for herself. Lester cursed under his breath but grabbed his coat. If we do this, he said, we go armed. He tossed her a flashlight and pulled out an old revolver. Let's go. They found it, deep in the woods, hidden, forgotten. The house was rotting, covered in vines, the windows shattered. Eleanor's stomach tightened. Something terrible had happened here. Inside, the air was stale, damp. Furniture was smashed, as if someone had tried to erase any sign of life. Then, a sound. A floorboard creaked upstairs. They weren't alone. Lester raised his gun as they moved upstairs. A figure stood in the shadows, a frail old man, his face sunken, his hands shaking. You shouldn't be here, he croaked. Eleanor stepped forward. Who are you? The man's hollow eyes stared at her. I was the one who called the police that night, he whispered. I heard them crying. Eleanor's blood ran cold. He grabbed her wrist, his grip shockingly strong. They took them, he rasped. Not just the school bus, others. For years, Lester gritted his teeth. Who? The old man let out a dry laugh. You already know. Eleanor couldn't breathe. She flipped through the police reports again. The name that had appeared too many times. The wealthiest family in town. The Harringtons. Landowners. Politicians. Untouchable. She looked at Lester. They funded the search for the missing kids, she whispered. They stood on stage with the sheriff, cried for the cameras. Lester's jaw tightened. And all the while, they were the ones who took them. A slow, chilling realization crept over Eleanor. The bus was never meant to reach its destination. It had been led away, and the town had helped cover it up. By the time Eleanor got home, she knew. She was being watched. A black car sat parked down the street, engine running, tinted windows. Her hands shook as she unlocked her front door. On the kitchen table, another note waited for her. This time it was shorter. Walk away. Or next time, it's Lily. Her heart stopped. She called Lily. No answer. Panic exploded inside her. She grabbed her coat, keys, her entire body trembling. Lester answered on the first ring. They took my daughter. A long pause. Then his voice came, low and dark. Then we burned them to the ground. Eleanor is no longer just searching for the truth. She knows who's behind it. She knows why they did it. And now, it's personal. The final act begins. This is no longer about finding answers. This is about taking them down. Eleanor sat in a quiet cafe, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She hadn't touched it. Her mind was elsewhere, on the note she'd received 2 days ago. The warning had been simple but chilling. Stop asking questions, or else. She should have listened. She should have walked away. But how could she? For decades, she had lived with the ghosts of those missing children, their faces haunting her every step. She was about to give up when she saw him. Across the street, stepping off a bus, was a man, tall, rugged, with deep-set eyes that carried a weight she recognized. His hair was darker now, his features sharper with age, but she knew that face. Tommy, one of the missing children. Her breath caught in her throat. Her fingers gripped the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. It couldn't be. It had been 35 years. But there he was, alive. She barely had time to think before she was on her feet, moving on instinct. She pushed past chairs, nearly knocking over a waitress. Her heart pounded as she shoved the cafe door open. "Tommy!" she called. The man turned at the sound of his name. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Then, he ran. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She chased him. Tommy disappeared into the crowd. Eleanor ran after him, weaving through people, ignoring the protests and curses of pedestrians. She wasn't thinking, just moving. "Tommy, wait!" she shouted. The man glanced back, his expression flickering with something. Recognition? Fear? Then he picked up speed. Eleanor's lungs burned, but she pushed forward. The city streets blurred past her. She dodged a cyclist, nearly tripping over a curb. Tommy cut down an alleyway. Eleanor followed without hesitation. She turned the corner and stopped. The alley was empty. Gone. Vanished. She spun in circles, searching for any sign of him. A door swinging shut. Footsteps echoing. Anything. Nothing. Her hands trembled as she braced herself against the cold brick wall. She had seen him. He was real. He was alive. And he was running from something. Or someone. As Eleanor caught her breath, something caught her eye. A small, crumpled scrap of paper lay on the damp ground near a dumpster. She bent down, picking it up with shaky fingers. The ink was smudged, but she could still make out the writing. A phone number. And beneath it, a single word, scribbled hastily. Help! A chill ran down her spine. She looked around the alley one last time before hurrying back to the street. She needed a phone. Now Eleanor found a payphone on the corner of the street, her fingers trembling as she fed a few coins into the slot. She dialed the number from the paper, her heart pounding in her ears. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a voice answered. A man, low, cautious. Who gave you this number? Eleanor swallowed. Tommy. Silence. Then the man exhaled sharply as if cursing under his breath. His voice returned, urgent now. Meet me at the old train station. Midnight. Come alone. The line went dead. Eleanor stood there gripping the receiver, her breath shallow. She had spent decades chasing ghosts. Now one of them had come back. Midnight. The old train station loomed before Eleanor, abandoned and forgotten, its broken windows and peeling paint whispering of another time. She pulled her coat tighter around her, the cold biting through the fabric. A single street lamp flickered weakly, casting long shadows. The air smelled of rust and damp wood. Footsteps echoed. Eleanor turned sharply, her breath catching. A man stepped out of the darkness. He wasn't Tommy. He was older, 50s maybe, his face lined with deep scars. His clothes were worn, his posture stiff, like a man who had spent years looking over his shoulder. "You're in danger," he said. Eleanor folded her arms. "Tell me something I don't know." The man exhaled, shaking his head. "I knew those kids," he murmured. "I was there when they were taken." Her pulse jumped. "Who are you?" His gaze flickered toward the empty train tracks. "My name's Daniel Crow," he said, "and I've been running from this for 35 years. Daniel's hands trembled as he lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply before speaking. "I worked at the historical site, the place your kids were supposed to visit that day," he said. "But they never showed up, because they were never meant to." Eleanor's stomach churned. "What do you mean?" "The bus was rerouted, taken to a warehouse just outside town." He flicked ash onto the ground. "I was working nearby that day. I saw things I wasn't supposed to see." Eleanor gripped the bench. "Who did this?" Daniel hesitated. His voice dropped to a whisper. "The same people who led the search." She felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath her. The Harringtons, the wealthiest family in town, untouchable, respected, powerful, and the sheriff. The same sheriff who had led the investigation. The same sheriff who had been watching her. Eleanor sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel. Everything made sense now. The cold stares, the threats, the silence. The people she had trusted to find the children had been the ones to cover it up. She needed help. Lily was out of the question. Lester had disappeared. But there was one person who might listen. Owen Blake, a journalist. Young, ambitious, new to town. She found him in the dimly lit newspaper office, hunched over his desk, typing away. He barely looked up when she walked in. "I have a story for you," she said. Owen snorted. "Everyone does." Eleanor placed a thick folder on his desk. Owen flipped it open. His smirk faded. His eyes darted across the pages. Then he looked up at her, his face pale. "If this is real, you're about to start a war." The drive to the old warehouse felt endless. The night stretched on, heavy with silence. Owen sat in the passenger seat, his hands fidgeting with his camera. Eleanor kept her eyes on the road, gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. "This place, it's been abandoned for years," Owen murmured as they pulled up. Eleanor stepped out, staring at the decayed structure before them. The building loomed against the moonlit sky, its rusted metal siding peeling away like dead skin. They forced the rusted door open, stepping inside. The air smelled of dust, mold, and something else. Something old and forgotten. Owen snapped photos as they walked, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Then, Eleanor saw it. An old, rusted school badge half buried under debris. She knelt, brushing away the dirt. The words were faint but still legible. "Property of Willow Creek Elementary." A sharp breath left her lips. "This is it," she whispered. "The bus was here." Owen crouched beside her, his voice hushed. "If they brought the kids here, where did they take them next?" Eleanor turned to answer when she saw something that made her blood run cold. Etched into the wall, barely visible beneath layers of grime. "Help us." Her stomach twisted. The children had been here, and no one had come. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the sound of shattering glass. She bolted upright, heart hammering. The smell of gasoline filled the air. She ran to the window and froze. Her car, its tires were slashed. The windshield was smashed. Someone had spray painted one word across the hood. "Stop." She rushed to the front door. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Neighbors, shop owners, familiar faces from the town. They weren't here to help. Some whispered. Others glared. Sheriff Briggs stood by his squad car, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. "This is what happens when you don't let things go," he called out. Eleanor clenched her fists. She wasn't letting go. She was just getting started. That night, Eleanor sat in her darkened living room, her laptop open in front of her. Owen's article had gone live. The story was spreading, but it wasn't enough. She needed Tommy. She had to find him. before they did. Then, the phone rang. She stared at the number on the screen. Unfamiliar. Her hands shook as she picked up. "Hello?" Silence, then a voice. Rough. Faint. "I remember." Her breath caught. "Tommy?" A pause, then, "Yes," he rasped, "and I know where the others are." Eleanor's grip tightened on the phone. "Where?" she whispered. But before he could answer, a crash, a muffled shout, then the line went dead. Eleanor shot to her feet. Someone had found Tommy first, and now they were coming for her. Eleanor is closer than ever to the truth, but now she's running out of time. Tommy knows the answers, but will she find him before they do? The town wants her silenced. The sheriff is watching her, and someone in the shadows, will do whatever it takes to keep the past buried. Eleanor sat across from the frail old man in a dimly lit motel room. His hands trembled as he lit a cigarette, the smoke curling into the air like ghosts of his past. He had once been part of the syndicate that had terrorized the town, one of the men who had orchestrated the children's disappearance. Now he was nothing more than a shadow, haunted by the sins of his youth. "I need the truth," Eleanor said, her voice steady but edged with desperation. "Where did they take the children?" The man, Samuel Hayes, exhaled slowly. "You don't want to know, lady," he muttered. "I've spent 35 years chasing ghosts," Eleanor snapped. "I need to know what happened." Hayes hesitated, then leaned forward. "They were taken out of the country, the ones who survived." Eleanor's stomach turned. "Survived?" she repeated. Hayes nodded grimly. "Some of them didn't make it. They were too young, too weak. The ones who did," he shook his head, "they were sold. Wealthy buyers, private islands, foreign estates. The kind of people who don't leave loose ends." A deep, sickening silence filled the room. Eleanor gripped the arms of her chair. "Is Tommy alive?" she asked. Hayes sighed. "If you saw him, then maybe. Some of them escaped. We lost track of a few, but the ones who got out, they never came back." Eleanor closed her eyes. There was still hope. Tommy had survived. That meant others could have too. "Who was behind it?" she pressed. Hayes hesitated before uttering a name that sent ice through Eleanor's veins. Martin Caldwell. The name belonged to one of the town's most powerful men, a businessman who had built an empire over the decades, a man who had never been touched by the law. Eleanor felt her heartbeat quicken. She had spent years looking for the truth, but now the truth was looking right back at her, and it had the face of a man who would do anything to keep his secrets buried. She had what she needed. Now it was time to act. Eleanor sat in her car outside Caldwell Industries, gripping the steering wheel as rain pelted against the windshield. The towering glass building in front of her was a monument to Martin Caldwell's wealth and power. Behind those tinted windows, he sat untouched by the suffering he had caused, a man who had built an empire on the backs of stolen children. She had spent decades searching for the truth. Now she was standing at its doorstep. Beside her, David Carter, the young journalist who had helped her uncover the syndicate's secrets, checked his recorder. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "Caldwell isn't just going to admit everything because you ask him to." Eleanor exhaled. "He doesn't have to. We have Hayes' confession. We have documents, records, leads. We just need him to slip." David hesitated. "If he realizes we know too much—" "I know," Eleanor interrupted. "That's why we do this now, before he has time to make us disappear too." They stepped out into the rain, the cold wind cutting through Eleanor's coat. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what she was about to do. She wasn't just confronting a criminal, she was taking on a man who had controlled the town for decades. Inside, the air was thick with expensive cologne and polished silence. The receptionist barely looked up before Eleanor announced, "I'm here to see Mr. Caldwell. It's urgent." Minutes later, they were ushered into a sleek, modern office where Martin Caldwell sat behind a massive desk, his silver hair neatly combed, his suit without a wrinkle. He barely looked up as they entered, as if he already knew why they were there. "Mrs. Grayson," he said, his voice smooth and controlled, "you've been stirring up quite a storm." Eleanor didn't sit. "Where are they?" she demanded. Caldwell sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You've wasted half your life chasing ghosts. Isn't it time to let it go?" David hit the record button on his hidden microphone. "We know what you did," he said. "We have proof. People are talking. It's over." Caldwell smirked. "Is it?" He folded his hands. "If you had anything solid, you wouldn't be here. You'd be at the police." Eleanor stepped closer. "I don't need the police," she said. "I need you to admit it." Caldwell's expression darkened. "Be careful, Mrs. Grayson," he said softly. "Some people don't like old secrets being dug up. Some people disappear just like that." He snapped his fingers. Eleanor's heart pounded, but she held his gaze. "Like the children you took?" she whispered. For the first time, Caldwell's jaw tightened. David slid a file onto the desk. "This is everything we have," he said. "We can take it to the media, or you can talk." Caldwell's eyes flicked to the folder. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. "You think you can touch me?" he said. "You're just an old woman. And you," he looked at David, "you're a nobody." Eleanor took a deep breath. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out a small black recording device. She pressed play. Hayes's voice filled the room. "The ones who survived were sold. Martin Caldwell orchestrated the whole thing." Caldwell's smile vanished. Eleanor stepped forward. "It's over," she said. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then slowly he reached for his phone. Eleanor braced herself. Then the door burst open. Security guards rushed in. Eleanor felt hands grab her arms, dragging her back. David shouted as they were forced toward the exit. As she was shoved into the hallway, Caldwell called after her. "You should have left it alone, Eleanor." The doors slammed behind them. Eleanor's chest heaved. They had gotten to him. He was scared, but he was also dangerous. As she and David stumbled into the storm outside, she knew one thing for certain. She had just declared war on a man who would do anything to silence her. The news broke the next morning. It started with a leak, an anonymous tip sent to several major newspapers and television stations. The recording of Hayes' confession, the documents David had compiled, a name that had loomed over the town for decades. Martin Caldwell. By noon, it was everywhere. Headlines screamed across the country. Prominent businessmen tied to 35-year-old child trafficking ring. New evidence emerges in the 1987 school bus disappearance. Survivors may still be out there. Eleanor sat in her small kitchen, staring at the television as reporters recounted the horrors that had unfolded all those years ago. The weight of it settled deep in her bones. She had spent decades screaming into the void, begging someone to listen. Now the world finally was. David sat across from her, his phone buzzing nonstop with calls from journalists, police investigators, and even families of the missing children. "They're reopening the case," he said, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "The FBI is involved. Caldwell's lawyers are scrambling, but this is too big to bury." Eleanor nodded, but a knot of unease twisted in her stomach. Caldwell wasn't a man who went down without a fight. A knock at the door made both of them jump. David reached for his phone, ready to call for help, but Eleanor placed a hand on his arm and walked to the door. She hesitated for only a moment before opening it. Sheriff Donahue stood outside, his face grim. Eleanor's pulse quickened. For years, the local police had ignored her, dismissed her as a grieving woman chasing ghosts. Now they couldn't look away. "Mrs. Grayson," Donahue said, "can we talk?" She stepped aside, letting him in. Donahue removed his hat and exhaled. "The governor has ordered a full investigation. The FBI is already looking into Caldwell's finances. But," he hesitated. "But what?" David asked. Donahue glanced at Eleanor. "We think Caldwell is going to run." Eleanor's stomach dropped. "He has money hidden overseas. He's got connections. If he disappears now, we may never bring him to justice." Eleanor clenched her fists. "Then we can't let him disappear." The sheriff sighed. "We're doing everything we can, but men like Caldwell, they don't leave trails. They make people disappear before they go." His eyes met Eleanor's. "You need to be careful." A cold chill ran through her. Donahue stood. If you hear anything, let me know. Eleanor walked him to the door, but as she turned back, David was already pulling up something on his laptop. I don't trust the police to catch him in time, he muttered, but I have a few contacts. If Caldwell is planning to run, we can find out where. Eleanor sat down beside him. Then let's find him before it's too late. Outside, the rain began to fall again, streaking the windows like tears. Eleanor stood in front of the old school building, staring at the faces of the children in a faded class photo from 1987. Tommy, Sarah, Emily, and all the others who had been lost that day. For so many years, their absence had been a weight on her soul, but now the world finally knew their story. The truth had come out. Martin Caldwell had been arrested at a private airstrip, attempting to flee the country with a fake passport. His empire was crumbling. More names were coming to light. Officials, law enforcement officers, and powerful men who had helped cover up the crimes. Some had already been arrested. Others had vanished, knowing their time was up. But the question that still haunted Eleanor was the same one that had kept her up at night for decades. Where were the children? Not all of them had survived. That much was clear. But somewhere out there were those who had. Adults now, scattered, broken, hiding. David stepped beside her. I spoke to the FBI this morning, he said. They're setting up a task force to track down any survivors. Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. You did it, he said softly. You never gave up. She turned to him, her expression weary but determined. It's not over until we find them. David smiled faintly. Then let's keep looking. That evening, Eleanor sat at her desk, flipping through an old notebook filled with names, dates, and notes from years of searching. The pages were worn, the ink smudged in places from tears. A knock at the door made her look up. Lily stood there. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lily stepped inside. I read the articles, she said. I saw what you did. Eleanor swallowed hard. I never meant to push you away. Lily exhaled. I know. She hesitated, then pulled out a book from her bag and placed it on the table. It was a draft, her mother's story, written in Lily's own handwriting. I want to help you finish it, she said. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. She reached across the table, taking her daughter's hand. Then let's finish it together. The town would never forget the missing children, but now they would also remember Eleanor Grayson, the woman who refused to let them be forgotten. And somewhere, out in the world, the survivors would know that someone had fought for them, that someone still was. Because some stories don't end. Some stories keep going, carried by those who refuse to stop searching for the truth. And Eleanor Grayson would search for as long as she had breath in her body. Guys, thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this story. Let us know about your thoughts in the comments section. Also, subscribe to the channel for daily stories notification.